Advanced Heroquest, the Jail of the Usurper, Part 4. Sven's throat felt tight. He breathed in deeply, but it felt like the air never reached his lungs. He frowned before hawking up more green mucus and spitting it out onto the corridor floor. Bloody nurglings. "Does the key fit?" Sven asked his fellow escapee, Lambert Lemberger. "Yes, dwarf, it does," came the reply as the human twisted the key in the lock. Immediately, Lemberger felt the portcullis grow loose and threw it upwards with a sonorous clang. "Subtle, manling, very subtle." In answer to the noise, feral grunts came from within the room. Grunts that Sven recognized all too well. They belonged to the beastmen of his father's murderer, the champion of chaos, Cronthog Hornhelm. They were the very same beastmen who had held him down and gagged him after he had emerged from the magical watery portal into this dowdy series of oubliettes. Their presence meant two things. Cronthog was close, and that time was of the essence. There was no time for subtlety anymore. Exploration and investigation had to give way to aggression and eradication. It was kill or be killed, and Sven had no intentions of dying before he was able to cross blades with Hornhelm once more. Sven Hamnerhelm had never taken, nor did he wish to take, the oath of a Drengi. He was no slayer, but he had sworn to himself to avenge his father's untimely death. "Get in there and ready your axe," Sven urged as the two stormed into the room. In this part of the expedition, the only members of the party were the newly diseased dwarf, Sven Hamnerhelm, mercenary and adventurer, and his ally, the mysterious axeman, Lambert Lemberger. With the locked door now open, we flipped over one of our monster encounter cards to see what lay within the quest room that the two heroes had uncovered. Revealing the card, we found out that the GM had 12 points with which to choose his monsters, and with the heroes being so close to the heart of Cronthog's jail, he felt it was appropriate to employ 3 of the Chaos Champion's elite bestigor bodyguards. He then laid out the furniture in the room, which included a wall, a table of liquor, a torture rack, a small blood-stained table, and a treasure chest. A pair of double doors lay at the far corner of the room. Next came the surprise roll, which the two heroes narrowly won. Sven's player placed the 3 beastmen, one close to the 2 heroes, whilst the other 2 at the end of the room adjacent to the treasure chest. Divide and conquer was the idea. The GM then moved each a square closer to the heroes. It was now the heroes' phase, and Lemberger at the fore hesitated not, moving past the spiked barricade decorated by the skeletal remains of former inmates up to the long table strewn with alcohol. Here he taunted the 3 beastmen to attack. They did not resist. Behind, Sven followed, although his little legs slowed him down. The nearest bestigor lolloped past the adjacent table, its 2 weapons held up high, and it hurled itself at Lemberger with a feral bray. The humans high weapon skill of 10 meant that the bestigor required a 10 to even hit him, and although it struck with surprising power and deftness, Lemberger was able to deflect both of its weapons away with his shield and axe. However, in doing so, he had left himself exposed to further attack. Onwards rushed the second of the beastmen, and, like his sibling, Bloodlust drove him like a hot iron into the fray. He took full advantage of the distraction that his brother Bestigor had provided, and slammed both of its weapons into the barbarian. The beastman then rolled a whopping 8 damage dice, requiring a 9 or more to wound. He inflicted 3 wounds onto Lemberger with ease. The hero's matted fur jerkin luckily softening the blows and preventing greater damage. However, the axeman was severely wounded, and it would not take much to finish him off. The third of the Bestigor brothers, too, moved to attack Lemberger, but had already been nuzzled out of striking distance by his 2 siblings. But his presence at least left the human completely surrounded. It was now Lemberger's turn to strike, and he lunged at the beastman that lay between him and the double doors at the far end of the room. He easily bypassed the weapon work of the Bestigor with his refined axemanship, and caused 4 wounds, 2 of which were critical. One of these yielded an additional wound, and it was this that was just enough to slay the creature. As the body began to fall, Lemberger slammed into it, knocking it out of the way and moving to take his position, allowing Sven to join the melee. This the dwarf immediately and most eagerly did, stopping only to apply some of the necrotic slime he'd collected in the previous room to his own weapon. And then launching himself straight into the nearest Bestigor. He hit and embedded the weapon deep into his foe, and the blade venom caused each successful wound to become 2 as its poisonous tendrils snaked their way through the veins of the stricken beastman. It began to froth at the mouth and quickly dropped down dead. Sven clambered over the corpse to bear down on the third and last beastman. It was now the last Bestigor's time to retaliate, and, having witnessed the brutal culling of its siblings, a fire was eating away at his belly. He bellowed as he brought his weapons down on Sven. The dwarf tried to deflect the blades, but was struck by both. However, with his new magical dwarf helm giving him a near impenetrable toughness of 11, it was going to be difficult to wound him, and indeed, all 8 damage dice failed to inflict even a single wound. Feral anger erupted from the Bestigor's throat, but the beast was no fool, and used the second part of its attack move action to turn tail and beat a tactical retreat to the far end of the room before turning to face the 2 escapees. There was no way that Lemberger was going to let this beastman escape, and immediately charged after the waiting Bestigor, his axe raised. Unfortunately, as he sent his weapon slicing down towards his foe, he slipped on one of the many foul beastman droppings that littered the room and tumbled over. The Bestigor hesitated not a moment, and pounced upon the stricken human with his mace and sword. Lemberger managed to turn aside the blade with his shield, but the mace struck his exposed chest, inflicting 3 damage and knocking him unconscious, and awaiting the death blow. Or at least it would have done, had Lemberger not spent a fate point. Instead, he thrashed from side to side and was able to dodge out of the way of both weapons. Meanwhile, Sven stuffed his pouches with as much liquor as he could fit and moved up in support of his ally. The beastman once more attacked with both of its weapons. This time, it had its mace turned aside, but it struck true with its sword. The blade bit deep, causing a critical wound and inflicting 2 damage, leaving Lemberger near lifeless, impaled on the bloody weapon. Or at least it would have done, had the human not again spent a fate point, his last, to negate all of the damage and turn the mortal blow into a colossal feint, leaving the weapon to narrowly miss his body, instead tearing another hole in his animal hide jerkin. Lemberger spat out blood and swiped at his belligerent enemy with his thirsting axe. He struck, and the weapon dug deep into the bestigor's flesh, inflicting 2 wholesome wounds on the Scion of Chaos. However, it was not enough to fell the bestigor. The human feared he had overplayed his hand, when suddenly a voice came from over his shoulder. "Manlin, you've done enough. Let me finish the job for you." Lemberger, too wounded and battle-weary to argue, used the second half of his attack move action to take a few steps back and make way for Sven. Sven did not hesitate and threw himself at the mauled beastman. He brought his hammer down strong and true, and immediately inflicted a massive 4 wounds on his foe, bludgeoning the creature to death. With the fight over, Lemberger staggered to the nearby table of booze and drank enough to completely take the edge off his wounds, while Sven moved to the nearby treasure chest. He smashed open the lock to find a potion within. Upon its label was written the Kazalid word Grizdal, which means a dwarf ale that has been fermented for at least a century and is renowned for its temporary strength-giving properties. Lemberger, too, grabbed himself a pair of magical potions to take along with him off the table, although each of these had Seamus Lager written on them. He was simply thankful that they weren't Talabheim Special, more commonly called Troll Squirt in Tobaro. The 2 heroes, once more composed and ready, came back to the large double doors and prepared to open it up to the adjacent room, the room that held the key out of the jail. But upon pushing on the door, they found it locked shut, no doubt barred on the opposite side. "Come on, Manlin, we've not come this far to be stopped by a door." The GM told the players that the door had the equivalent of 4 wounds and a toughness of 4. How Sven scoffed before raising his weapon and letting rip. He removed all 4 of its wounds in a single hammer blow, although in doing so, he alerted the denizens on the other side that intruders were abroad. There would be no surprise roll for the heroes in the next room. And so, finally, we got to total up the gold the 2 had found. This time, they'd gotten 80 gold crowns that had been secreted on the bodies of the bestigors, bringing the heroes' total to 480. Of course, if they didn't survive the final room and get the key, all the gold in the world would do them no good.